Right, I'm gonna have to hack the door. Technical. You'll need to turn around while I do this. Turn around! I'll only be a second, if you wouldn't mind. Would you mind, putting your back towards me so I can see only your back? Go on, just turn right the way around so you're not looking at me. Done! Hacked. Okay, go on, just pull that turret out.
Almost 10 years after its release, Portal 2 continues to be one of my favorite games ever. I've played through the main campaign at least 3 times already, both on Xbox and then also on PC, and I definitely played the co-op campaign at least as much. Each time because I wanted to introduce a new friend to the game that had never played it before. Alright, now keep walking. Go, go, go.
What, up, down?
Yeah, no, you go down obviously. I'm just looking at where you're supposed to go. I think you're supposed to walk forward now.
Blue
No.
just taught Orange a valuable lesson in travel.
They say that the old caretaker of this place went absolutely crazy. Chopped up his entire staff. They say at night you can still hear the screams.
In my opinion, Portal 2 is a masterpiece of a game because it has a unique game mechanic that no other game really has, which is, of course, the portal gun, and it combines it with interesting characters and a world that is surprisingly deep and dark for what is essentially a puzzle game.
Bring your daughter to work day. That did not end well.
Of course, I don't have to tell you all of this because I'm sure that most of you watching this video have played Portal 2 yourself. If not, then go play it right now. It's no more than $10 on Steam depending on your region, and it's worth the money. You'll be surprised, trust me. But while a lot of you have probably played Portal 2, what a lot of you probably haven't played yet is the mod that came out in 2015, Portal Stories Mel. This mod was developed by a small team called Prism Studios and is essentially a whole new single-player campaign with new puzzles, of course, much more difficult puzzles, but also a new story with fully voiced characters that takes place in the world of Aperture Science.
Hello there, gorgeous. Might I say you're looking as beautiful as a rainbow.
The game starts off by throwing you back to the year 1952, way before the events of Portal 1, and you start off in this train that takes you through one of the Aperture facilities. Seems familiar to anybody? You enter the facility, you go deep underground to test out one of Aperture's new relaxation vaults, which of course goes horribly wrong and puts you to sleep for many decades, only to wake up in a time somewhere between the events of Portal 1 and Portal 2. And because you're far underground, it's your job to basically get back to the surface, escape. Which isn't as easy because, as you know from playing both Portal 1 and Portal 2, everybody in Aperture died thanks to GLaDOS, and the facility is basically abandoned.
Don't mind all this too, we just had earthquakes. Lots of earthquakes. Yeah, you get lots of those here in Michigan.
And yeah, because it takes place in between Portal 1 and Portal 2, you will not be seeing much of GLaDOS, because, of course, Chell kills her in Portal 1 and then ends up waking her at the start of Portal 2. So in between, there's no GLaDOS. And you also will not be seeing much of Wheatley. Instead, you're accompanied by 2 new characters, Virgil and Aegis, who admittedly aren't as funny or interesting as the original 2. I mean, it is really hard to beat Wheatley as a side character. You know, 10 years later, he still makes me laugh on another playthrough.
Hey! Oi! I'm up here! Oh, brilliant! You did find a portal gun! Oh, do you know what? It just goes to show, people with brain damage are the real heroes in the end, aren't they, at the end of the day? Brave.
But Virgil still offers some good company throughout the story, even breaking the 4th wall and taking some pokes at Valve for never releasing a 3rd installment for any of their titles.
Alright, this next test chamber is still under construction. Generally, they need to be tested at least 3 times before they're finalized. Some people just can't count further than that, I guess.
But together with Virgil, you have to try to escape the seemingly abandoned Aperture Science in Portal fashion, which is going through several test chambers that will slowly take you upstairs. And I can tell you right now that this mod does not mess around. The first chapter of the game is very much a walking simulator and is mostly for setting up the scene, setting up the story. But once you actually get your hands on the portal gun and make it to the first room in chapter 2, you're going to be there for a little bit. The first real puzzle of the mod can be compared to the last puzzle room of Chapter 7 of the original Portal 2 campaign, both in difficulty and what kind of puzzle elements are used. If you need a refresher, this is the part in the game where you've had plenty of time to mess around with both gels, and you're thrown into this open room with many different parts to it, where for one of the first times in the game, you don't have any new mechanics thrown in your face, but it still isn't quite obvious what the first step should be if you wanted to beat the room. You know, you gotta get some repulsion gel on this angled platform and some propulsion gel on the platform below it to launch yourself to the cube. And then you gotta get some repulsion gel on this rotating platform, place the cube on the button to rotate it upwards permanently. And then you gotta put some gel here and connect the slope to the other platform with portals. And then you can launch yourself to the elevator. It's not insanely complicated, and when I put it out like that, it seems pretty straightforward, but when you enter the room and do it for the first time, you don't really know where to start, because there's all these components and there's no clear indication of what to do first. And this is exactly what most of the puzzle rooms in Portal Mel stories feel like. It basically builds on this idea. We have big rooms with plenty of different components to it, and almost every time you walk into one, especially once you get a bit further into the game, you really have to take a look around and figure out what the goal of the room is and how many components there are to it. It starts off in difficulty that is somewhat comparable to this very room at the end of Chapter 7, but it gets more difficult very fast. Although never too difficult or gimmicky. The game never asks you to do some crazy unknown mechanics that only speedrunners would think of.
Very good. You are now in possession of the Aperture Science handheld portal device. With it, you can create your own portals. You're doing very well.
The puzzle rooms are very much meant to be beaten in traditional ways that you have learned from the base game as well. It's just about figuring out what to do and in what order, rather than knowing some exploits about the game. Now, the mod's not perfect. There are some puzzle rooms that you can cheese. For example, I think I cheesed the second room on the first chapter by jumping off of a cube that was on a button and then basically pushing the cube off as I jumped off of it so that the elevator behind me would activate. That's how I beat that room, and I still don't really know how to do it legit. I could probably watch a tutorial, but I think it's more fun to do it this way. But yeah, it's rather about just figuring out what to do and in what order. I think the reason that I found most of the puzzles in this mod to be so challenging is because a lot of them often require you to reset items. In many cases, you have 1 or 2 cubes in a room and you need to use those for different purposes, which sounds easy enough, you know, bring the cube here, bring the cube there, but oftentimes you can't really bring the cube with you because there's a shield blocking you, or there's some other reason as to why you couldn't bring the cube with you because the cube needs to stay on a certain button for you to get through a door or something. Now, what the developers want you to do is to use the cube for one purpose and then set up portals so that you can easily get to the next place where the cube needs to be, and then go back to the cube spawn room to press the button there and reset the cube. A good example of what I'm trying to explain would be this seemingly small and simple room towards the end of Chapter 4. It's a very simple room and there's not much to it, but it's still quite complicated if you're not thinking about the cube as a reset button. There's basically an inner room with a turret and a door that you need to go through. And there's an outer room, which you start off in. There's also a laser and 2 buttons that do something if the laser makes contact. You know, one of those buttons opens the door. The other one removes the shield. The blue shield that removes your portals once you go through it. And there's of course a cube to redirect the laser. Now this seems simple enough on the surface, right? Just place some portals so that the laser destroys the turret, and point the laser to the button that opens the door, and we're done. But that's not really it, because to get to the door, you have to pass through the shield, which will then remove the portals, and thus will break the laser connection with the button, which means that the door closes again. What you actually have to do, and don't worry, this is the only puzzle that I will spoil during this whole video, which is why I choose this puzzle in particular, because it's such a small puzzle and such a good example of what I'm trying to explain. Now what you actually have to do here is line up the laser with portals so that it touches the button that opens the door without the cube. And then you grab the cube and place the cube in such a way that it redirects the laser towards the button that removes the shield. Once the shield is removed, you can walk to the inner circle, and there you can click on the button to basically reset the cube. After the cube disappears, your portals should still be lined up in the same way, and then the laser will go through both portals, hitting the button that opens the door again, and that allows you to pass the room. So yeah, you're basically using the cube for one purpose, then setting up the portals in a certain way, so that when you reset the cube, those portals still have use and you can proceed. It took me a while to think as cubes like this, to always think about having them in two places at once. Because the base game, again, never asks you to do that. In the base game, you only press a button for a cube if somehow you messed up something with the previous cube. With this mod, the buttons for the cubes are an active part of the puzzle solution.
Well done! Test subjects rated that as one of the hardest tests in this track.
So yeah, the puzzles are pretty complicated, and that was nice to see. It was a real challenge. But something that sets this mod apart from something like the custom maps that you can play on the Steam Workshop is that, just like in the base game, the mod often takes you on interesting detours through Aperture Science, or whatever is left of it. You aren't just mindlessly solving room after room without a real story. There are big set pieces in place that add a lot to the world building, and in some cases your sidekick, Virgil, even reacts to what you're doing in the game, just like characters in the base game do as well.
Your life is at stake, and you're going to walk up the stairs with falling rocks everywhere. What's wrong with you?
Chapter 2, for example, has a total of 7 normal puzzle rooms, where you simply solve puzzles until you take the elevator, or until you get to the next room, and you proceed. But there's also a big chunk of Chapter 2 that you'll spend off-site doing other things, such as using your portal guns to redirect water to put out fires, or to just activating generators, or even using objects in the environment to get to certain places you otherwise couldn't have gotten to. The story is very much about escaping Aperture Science, and there's a lot of puzzle rooms, but there's also a lot of story to it. Chapter 2, 3 and 4 all follow this formula, and they have some amazing environments that really give you a feel of just how big Aperture Science really is. You'll usually do a couple of difficult rooms, and then you get some easier ones as the game's focus falls back on the storyline progression and the world building.
Hey! Over here! I'm right over here! Hey, Mel. Nice to finally see you. It's kind of dark here, though. You should turn the power on so we can get the lights working.
There's also a couple of new ideas that the mod added to the game that combine storytelling parts with more traditional test rooms, such as this room, which is sort of off-site. It's not really a puzzle room, and at first it seems really easy, but once you beat it, you then have to beat it 2 more times, and each time it gets more difficult as some components in the room change or get added. It's essentially still the same puzzle room with the same goal, but just a couple of variables can make a huge difference in how easy or how difficult it is to beat. Something that you will also notice when playing this mod is how few loading screens there are compared to the base game. Oftentimes you can run through 2 separate puzzle rooms that are both very big without ever going through a loading screen. Somehow the modders have managed to cram more stuff into the game per loading screen than the developers at Valve did. I did experience some inconsistencies in performance though. For example, when activating certain buttons in a certain order, the game would hitch for a couple of milliseconds. I'm not sure if that's related or if that's something else entirely, but the mod is less smooth at times than the base game, at least in my experience. And if that all sounds pretty nice, like a really good mod, I've got one more very big surprise to you. This mod also has an advanced mode, which when I first started playing I thought it was something along the lines of maybe having a timer for the puzzles, trying to be as fast as possible, or a total score of how many or how little portals you used during any given run, but I was very wrong about that. In advanced mode, almost every single puzzle room in the game has some changes in order to make it more difficult. Some changes are pretty simple, for example adding another shield somewhere in order to make things just a bit more difficult or complicated. In other cases, entire rooms are added and some mechanics are just changed to make it even more challenging. And again, it is surprising just how much more difficult a room can get by just changing a couple of things. This room, for example, is one of the first rooms of Chapter 3. It took me about 2 minutes to figure out on a normal story mode. Easy, right? Then, on the challenge mode run, I was in there for more than 25 minutes. And the room is pretty much almost the same. Now, could I have been lucky on story mode that I figured out the solution really fast? Or maybe was I not as sharp during the advanced mode run, maybe I was tired. It's all possible, and this was a bit of an outlier, but when looking at the footage I can still see huge differences in the time that it took me to solve the rooms. Now, do I think it's worth to run through the game twice in order to see both versions? I don't think so. I did because I have the time right now and I wanted to see if I could beat the game on advanced mode as well. But looking back at it, the puzzles aren't that different. I think the advanced mode is just there for people that are a lot more experienced with Portal, or at least the players who have played Portal recently. And then the normal mode is for pussies. The mod is not perfect, you know, there's still some things missing from the mod that I quite liked about the base game. However, I'd say that those are mostly pet peeves. But yeah, there's something with sound, for example. There's a little change in sound in the base game every time you bounce off some repulsion gel. This was sort of the game's way of telling you that you did the right thing without giving you a straight up tutorial or straight up saying that you did the right thing. And I thought that this was a pretty cool way that the game helped out to teach you how the repulsion gel worked. The mod doesn't have things like that, or at least I haven't noticed it as much. Maybe that's because the developers assumed that you already knew all these things, but it made me quite sad because now I can't aimlessly bounce around the room and still feel like I'm making progress. Also, I didn't find the ending very satisfying. I'm of course not going to spoil it, but the boss fight mechanics were, they were kinda meh in my opinion. You basically don't really use portals at all, and in a game that's all about portals, you'd hope that the boss fight would also force you to use portals in some unique way, much like both of the boss fights did in the base game. You'll also not see any super crazy stuff that is completely out of the box, like some of the custom Portal 2 maps that are on the workshop that can be these complete mindfucks where you go through some doorframe, but then what you see on one end is not where you end up on the other end. It's very confusing. The mod doesn't have anything crazy like that. It's all pretty traditional in terms of puzzle mechanics. They're just used in really smart and clever ways. Now, this is probably done on purpose. It seems like the developers really wanted this to essentially be a DLC for Portal 2, as if it were made by Valve themselves. It follows a lot of the same design choices, from not making the final chapter all too difficult so that the player can solve them rather fast, and that then gives them some sense of urgency. But again, it also has those breaks and story moments in between traditional rooms, just like the base game. So if the goal was to make it as close to Portal 2 as possible in terms of mechanics and in terms of just how the game plays out, I think it 100% succeeded. If you played Portal 2 and if you're sad that there will never be a third game or another story-based DLC for Portal 2, well, I highly suggest you pick up this mod because it is the closest that you will ever get to a proper Portal 2 DLC. And it's 100% free, by the way. If you have Portal 2 on Steam, you can just download this for free. You gotta have Portal 2 though, the base game. And yeah, that was pretty much the video. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, see you later.